Welcome everybody. Our speaker today is Chris Giacomantonio, who's currently a Research Associate at Piers Lab, previously the Research Coordinator for Halifax Regional Police Force, and an adjunct at the School of Nursing. And Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thanks. Thanks, Julie, for the introduction. So today I'm going to be talking about scientific uncertainty and evidence-based crime policy. And for anyone who was there, Julie and I were having a brief kind of introductory conversation for a moment. You know, I think for people who are listening in, hopefully at least the concepts and ideas around scientific uncertainty and how we navigate that generally will be of interest. And then more specifically, if there's anyone on the call who's doing work in crime policy, the intersections of crime and health, or harm reduction work, maybe some of that information will also be relevant. But I'm also, you know, when we get into the sort of questions and conversation, I'm very interested to hear how these ideas land in other fields, because my field is sort of criminology and social policy. And so a lot of what I'm interested in is social intervention, but you know, I have a bit of a more narrow focus on what I have good expertise in. So I'd be very interested to know if these problems of scientific uncertainty are equally true or differently true in other social and health policy contexts. I'll just say that, and hopefully I can make all this work. This comes from a paper that I'm working on with several colleagues. We've been working on it for a little while. All of us are in one way or another involved in criminal justice policy, and particularly providing sort of evidence-based or science-based advice to practitioners and decision makers. So what I kind of consider like intelligent lay audiences. And so I'll use that phrase you know, several times. So people who don't have scientific training, social scientific training, but who as a part of their role are required from time to time to consume scientific knowledge. So we got together and started talking about some of the problems I'll talk about here. And so we thought we'd write a paper. And so this is a presentation that's based on that. I'll give you a brief overview of what I'm going to do. The first is just talk about what I mean by uncertainty, why it matters for translation, why it matters for the communication of science. And then I'm going to provide some key concepts that I've drawn out of other scientific fields where the challenges of scientific communication are a little better articulated. And then I'm going to consider the specific field of, here, hold on just a sec. I'm just going to switch my headphones. Hold on just a moment. All right, are we okay there? Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to switch. Yeah, okay, good. Sorry, I'm just going to back up. So then I'm going to talk about the specific field where I have expertise, which is evidence-based policy in criminal justice and criminal justice policy, and you know, related areas of policy. And then I'm going to conclude with what I think is essentially the kind of normative challenge that this problem brings up for us as researchers engaged in translational work, and an empirical project specific to the criminal justice sphere that my colleagues and I are now pursuing. Just to start off about scientific communication generally, why we do it, I'm drawing from a report done in 2017 on communicating science effectively by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in the US. And they set out sort of 5 main purposes for communicating science. And the first two, well, the first one in particular is just about, you know, creating excitement about science. So we can all be excited when we find out, for example, that Pluto is no longer considered a planet, but is now a Plutoid, but it might not influence whether or not we make any decisions about our lives and how we act in the world. And the second and third and fourth and fifth kind of move us up a scale of things that are helping us start to navigate the world. So to increase appreciation for science as a way of navigating the world, I think is the starting point for why we would think about making anything like evidence-based. to increase knowledge and understanding, so to overcome gaps in knowledge or lack of awareness. And then moving down that to influence behaviors, to influence decisions, to influence outcomes, policies, etc. And then to also to engage with groups so that those groups who are affected by new scientific knowledge, either if that leads to new policy or just our new awareness that this impact is being felt by a group, that we can use scientific communication to work with those groups to make policy solutions and decisions better on their behalf, on behalf of people like them. So those are some reasons for communicating science. So where does uncertainty figure into this? Sorry, I'll start with this. So another kind of key concept that's important here, and probably everyone on the who's watching this has some understanding of this concept, is the idea of things being evidence-based. And so when we communicate, when we talk about communicating that something is evidence-based, we're saying that the traditional model of considering something evidence-based is that it's been rigorously evaluated, that it has a strong demonstrated body of proof that shows that it works in several contexts and settings, that the tests have been repeated, and that the research design is a strong, ideally randomized controlled trial or natural experiments repeated over and over, so that we get an idea that something is in fact evidence-based. So that's the definition of the Oregon Research Institute. I'm sure there's lots out there, but I think we also think about things as evidence-based. More recently, definitions have been moving towards a more flexible definition of evidence-based. So if we think about the one we just looked at as evidence-based being a binary, so it is or it is not evidence-based, we can also see newer definitions of evidence-based talking about the use of best available evidence. So it doesn't necessarily hinge on randomized controlled trials being kind of gold standard research, but rather that different kinds of problems require different kinds of evidence. And we want to make our decisions with the best available evidence at the time that we can make the decision. Now, when I talk about evidence-based policy in crime sphere, both of these, or either of these definitions, I think could equally apply to the kinds of challenges and ideas I'm going to be addressing here. So whether we think of evidence-based as being a binary, something passes the threshold and it now is evidence-based, or it does not pass that threshold and it's not, or if it's something that's more on a scale of being more or less evidence-based, I think the problem of uncertainty is still more or less the same problem. So why does uncertainty matter? So in all scientific communication and all science, we need to be kind of aware that all science is uncertain. So scientific evidence is subject to constant revision. It's never a settled matter. We never really know if something works, but when we talk about things like evidence-based practice, we often revert to phrasings like what works. And we have some responsibility to communicate the limitations to the evidence base. But we also need to be aware that over-expressing uncertainty and kind of continually reminding people that we don't know for sure can have negative impacts and can negatively impact decisions and behaviors. So we need to find a balance between our responsibility to communicate the evidence base, or the limitations to science, and the fact that science may change, and balance this with how we express uncertainty. So I think uncertainty in criminology, why it matters to the problem I'm looking at, is that uncertainty is particularly under-theorized in criminology and evidence-based practice within criminal justice and related policy. And what we've seen recently is that messages in this field, and I'm sure in other fields, kind of overpromise what evidence can do. So you hear people say things like the evidence will speak for itself, or that the evidence on this matter is settled, or alternately we will wait until the evidence is settled, or wait until the evidence is in. So that's one side of the problem. The other is that people kind of overemphasize the unknown. So they say, well, that worked in Tulsa, or that worked in Seattle, or that worked in Prince Albert, but why would we believe it would work here? And we know nothing about whether it would work here. You hear people say that as well. We know nothing about this, but we know something, but we don't know maybe as much as people express that we do. And so that's a tension that's really active in criminal justice policy. But also why this matters is very little is known about how science and uncertainty about that science are digested by policy and decision maker audiences. So we don't really know what an intelligent lay audience hears when they hear that the science is incomplete, that there's lots of questions still to be done, the traditional research paper ending of more research needs to be done. We don't know how that message is digested by someone who doesn't have scientific training or who isn't familiar with the kind of ever-present revisionist tendencies of empirical social science. So just as one more kind of foundational concept here, when we talk about uncertainty in this context, this is drawing from a paper by Vanderblas and colleagues, that there's sort of two essential forms of uncertainty here. One is epistemic, that's about things we don't know but could know, and the other is aleatory uncertainty, which is about things that we can't really know. So the things that what will or won't happen, the things that are governed more by chance or probability. And I know there are people who would, you know, who work in worlds where risk and probability are measurable quantities, and we might consider those as part of epistemic uncertainty when they're genuinely measurable, and we might consider them as part of aleatory uncertainty when they're not. So that's not super important for the rest of this talk. But in this talk, we really are focused more on epistemic uncertainty. So things we do know, things we could know but don't yet know, and how the difference between those two commodities in the expression of scientific knowledge to intelligent lay audiences, how those are taken in. So I kind of, one of the ideas I think is really useful to draw us into this problem of uncertainty. I'm just drawing a quote from Greenhall and Capuzzi, who've been working on this issue for much longer than I have in the translational health sciences realm. Kind of problematizes this evidence-based sounds. And I won't read the whole quote out. I'm sure you can do that from where you are. But there's just this one central point in the middle, which I think is really useful as a starting point for us to be aware of, and we probably all are, is that, you know, the gap between what we consider the evidence-based ideal, so having enough evidence around the solution or intervention to a problem in the social sphere, is that having enough evidence to consider something evidence-based compared to the kind of need to act now, the need to make decisions on the basis of incomplete or contested data is usually very wide. And I think that this is a really helpful characterization of the actual challenge that we almost always face. So it's a real rarity, especially in criminal justice policy, that we find ourselves facing a problem where we don't see a very limited evidence base, and still the need to make a decision, and ideally to inject the best available evidence into that decision. So that's, I think, an ever-present problem for all translational science and communication of scientific evidence to kind of decision-making policy and practitioner audiences. I'm using those as kind of three separate chunks, so it's not one group, it's decision-making policy practitioners, but decision makers, policy makers, practitioners, who may be the same person, but maybe different people. And so I think that's an important concept for us to ground all of this discussion. And so we're always somewhere in an imperfect position on the scale of things being evidence-based. So what do we know so far? So we know that the science is revisionist. We know that there are limits to the concept of things being evidence-based. We know that uncertainty is a component of science, but what do we know about communicating scientific uncertainty? And it's wait, sorry, I'm hearing some feedback there. Maybe that's so what we know about scientific uncertainty and its communication, we know a few things, and it's much better developed in other fields like climate science, education, health, than it is in criminal justice policy. But first, we know that experts are reluctant to express uncertainty. So we know from work with experts, qualitative research with experts, that they believe that expressing the level of uncertainty that they have about their findings will make them seem less, will make their findings less likely to be taken on board, will make them seem less competent. So it's a risk of what they believe is their social capital with the expert audiences. We know that the communication of scientific research, whether or not it accounts for uncertainty, creates risks for the communicator and risks for the science. So there's this phenomenon that was identified a few years ago called the easiness effect, which is a problem that arises when scientific evidence is communicated to non-expert audiences who then believe they are less in need of expert support in interpreting the complexity of knowledge that's involved here. And I'm sure we're all guilty of this at one point or another. So personally, kind of like if I read an article in the Atlantic on the relative value of carbon capture versus carbon tax, I may consider myself for a period to be a knowledgeable person who's capable of talking authoritatively on these topics. But I don't know anything about that, really. I don't know the underlying science, and I won't understand the underlying science without years of training. So, but that has given me a false confidence in my ability to interpret science, and we can see that, we can see that problem across all scientific spheres where, expert developed evidence is then read by non-expert knowledge, consumers of that evidence. And then finally, we know that it can create the risk of a credibility problem. So whether or not someone communicates scientific evidence in good faith, if it leads people to believe things that aren't true or turn out not to be true in the end, that creates so Lewis and Weyer psychologists, what they've referred to as a credibility revolution in psychology, where scientific findings have been over or misinterpreted many times. And this is also true. They talk about psychology and education. And as a result, those fields then are diminished in the eyes of the intelligent lay audiences who have made decisions, either personal or professional, based on their incomplete understanding of incomplete science, and now think it was the science's fault rather than the interpretation of a body of evidence that was the problem. So that's kind of the broader picture of scientific communication and scientific uncertainty that we're working with in some of the main conceptualizations. And now I'm going to kind of briefly go through the criminal justice area, only because it would take too long to go in depth into any of these concepts. But in the question period, I'd be happy to go in more depth into some of those concepts if needed. So now I'm going to talk about criminological uncertainty. These are from my co-authors and I. This is what we believe. So we believe all of what I've just said about the general challenges of scientific uncertainty are generally true about the field of criminology, about the field of using, and not just criminology, but any use of social science in application to crime or social harm problems. We think that's probably true. That's a good stage to be set. But also there's unique aspects about our understandings of crime and harm in criminology and the field of criminology. And so I think those are worth drawing out as well. So the first point is that criminology is a particularly uncertain discipline. So it's a field that has almost no methodological coherence. It draws from economics, psychology, sociology, political science. And so there's no set rules of engagement with how we create evidence, how we use evidence. And it's relatively new, so it's younger than all of those. Moreover, even the areas where there's been a lot of research, where there's been tens or hundreds of randomized controlled trials, so things like focused deterrence, which is kind of the basis for the ceasefire or cure violence model, if people have heard of that, procedural justice, or problem-oriented policing or hotspots policing, areas where there's been a reasonably substantial amount of academic study, we still have very limited predictive value on how any criminal justice intervention will land when put in a new context or when scaled to a different population, or to an expanded program. So we just don't know, even with the best established criminological evidence, about things that reduce harm, things that reduce the harms of the criminal justice system, or things that address specific types of crime problems. We just know very little about what is likely to work. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but we still have a good amount of research, and certainly a lot more than we used to. The second point is that, unlike several other disciplines where evidence-basedness is a goal, criminology and criminal justice is an area where most of the practitioners have almost no required engagement with science prior to their being hired as practitioners. So where you might, and I know people who know the history of medicine will know that, even doctors fought against the use of kind of research science in say, surgery. In criminal justice, the problem is sort of very present and acute, that you have people who would have worked their whole career in what they considered a blue-collar occupation and never had to apply scientific reasoning to the decision to choose one policy over another, or to choose one action over another. So it's very much professional craft knowledge that dominates the field. So there's been several researchers who have looked at this problem in policing, particularly where it's most well developed. And they find that even among people who accept that you should kind of move towards an evidence-based ideal, they still, in practice, prioritize professional knowledge in policy and decision-making. So even the ones who have advanced degrees, even the ones who have backgrounds in science, even the ones who have signed on as kind of members of societies of evidence-based policing, they still prefer and will rank order professional knowledge above research knowledge almost invariably. The third point, and this probably applies to most fields, but even more so because we just haven't done the work in criminology, is that effective communication is not evidence-based. And what this means is that we know very little about how this, this variably receptive criminal justice practitioner audience actually consumes the messages we try to craft. So we don't know much about why some messages land with an audience and why others don't. We have kind of folk knowledge about it, but we don't have actual good knowledge. And then finally, evidence has limits, and this gets back to the discussion earlier on the limits to the evidence-based paradigm. We just need to come to a more realistic conceptualization of what evidence can do, and it won't make the decisions for us. And we need people to understand that evidence-based practice doesn't mean that the evidence makes the decision, but it's part of the discussion. It's part of our understanding of what we can do within a specific material, political, and social reality. I won't try to explain the satisficing and bounded rationality context just over time, but I can come back to that if people are interested. So this leads us, and I think where we come to on this, and I know we're not the first to get there, but since we're trying to apply this specifically to the criminological field, is that this is ultimately first a normative challenge. It's one about our personal engagement with our ethics as researchers. So between our balancing our responsibility to admit that science is incomplete and limited, and our responsibility to take the incomplete limited science and help to guide better decisions and away from worse decisions. And I don't think what we kind of have come to in our discussions among the authors is that this isn't something where we're going to come up with a formula. We're not going to say, here's a threshold at which we can tell someone to do something. Here's the threshold at which we kind of have to retain equipoise. Some of that will be about, it will be based in our theories on how the world works, on what is a benefit and what is a disbenefit for people acting within the world. And so some of that is going to be inherently personal or theoretical or ideological. So it's not going to be, the problem won't be solved the same for everyone. But I think it's important, and one of the things we try to draw out in our papers, that it's important for all of us to address this as a normative challenge first. You have to satisfy normative questions moral and ethical questions about how you as a researcher feel it's okay to interact with the world. You have to satisfy those before you can go about giving scientific advice in a coherent way. And so this gets to questions about what is social science good for? So what do we believe we're doing this for? What was the goal of our research practice? But what's also for the good of science? So what kinds of acts can we take or avoid that will kind of attenuate the risk of having a credibility problem for the science as a whole, or for the use of science more generally? And then also it points us towards not avoiding areas where we don't have much evidence, but rather thinking back to the principles that exist in current evidence. So what we know in criminal justice interventions is that there are higher level principles from other projects elsewhere, such as proactive problem solving, focused interventions, and ensuring that there's sort of procedural justice and fairness in those interventions. That we see those as relative constants when we see successful intervention. But it's also it doesn't recognizing that there's this uncertainty and that we can work from high level principles doesn't absolve us from, of course, continuing to build this evidence base, imperfect as it may be. So we still retain that responsibility to keep building evidence about what works or what has worked elsewhere under certain circumstances. And then finally, this leads us to what we think is a useful empirical project in our area. And I know versions of this have been tested with decision makers in other spheres, is that, once we know what evidence we want to convey, once we think we have an understanding, however we've solved our sort of normative and epistemological challenges about what we do know, what it means for decisions that should be made. Now we have to try to understand whether our expression of that new knowledge, or that our expression of the messages we think are fair and appropriate to bring forward from the scientific sphere to the decision-making sphere. We now still don't know if it's being heard the way we hope it's being heard. And so this, we think, sets an agenda for experimental work, of working with kind of intelligent lay audiences in the criminal justice practice sphere to try to apply decision, or to share scientific messages phrased differently. So some phrased with more certainty, some phrased with less certainty, some phrased with more clear decision paths, some phrased with a wider range of potential options, to understand which messages are being heard the way we hope that the message we're trying to convey is heard. And so that's something we're starting to pursue with the police agencies we as authors for this paper work with, to try to find ways to test different messages, especially in the kind of training and education space. So that brings me to the conclusion of my presentation. As I said, I'm very interested in hearing other people's thoughts on other areas that some of these ideas apply and how they apply to those other areas. So I'll leave it there and pass it back to Julie.
Thank you so much for that. And let's open it up to questions.
Oh, I see one from Marilyn.
Yes, hi, Chris. Thank you. Certainly, I think, your presentation applies everywhere, quite frankly. In the context that we're currently living, that being the context of a pandemic, and the desire to assure individuals about what to do and when to do it. So the what, certainly thinking about the assurances that many individuals need, and yet the uncertainties that actually are alive and well, always have been, but there are moments, and this being one of the moments, where the what would I say? The acknowledgement of uncertainty is such. You feel like you're on quicksand, or many feel like they're in quicksand, and so I guess it makes me think about a variety of things. It's not as though these uncertainties aren't always with us, but I believe they make themselves much more evidenced at certain moments. And then for me, it also makes me think about the way we look at evidence and how individual that is or group related that is, etc. So in other words, there is, I believe that we do transmit to society, or attempt to, that there is a way of knowing when really that's incorrect. And so, you know, it's not as though I have a question, Chris, so much as your presentation is confirming of the world that we do live in, and the complexities and how the tensions that exist between just give me an answer and what really plays into attempting to do that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I'm glad that the ideas sort of all make sense to you as well. I think that, you know, for us, one of the things, I think your point about different ways of knowing and interpreting evidence is super important in all of this, and that's why I think we one of the challenges we see, and you know, in our world, and I know this happened with evidence-based medicine as well in the early days, probably still is part of the debate, is that there are people who are very evangelical about the notion of evidence-basedness, and they believe that it's going to create kind of revolutionary outcomes because it's going to finally settle a lot of debates. And I think you know, I have yet to see an actual evidence, like a data set, any body of evidence, any systematic body of evidence that actually does that. And I think our interpretation of it is going to, you know, inescapably be personal. That doesn't mean we can't try to be systematic about it. It doesn't mean that we can't try to or be open to changing our perspective based on evidence. But ultimately, what we think the evidence says is something we need to be reflexive about, which is, I think, that sort of normative challenge. And that's, I think, front and center for me. And where we land on this is everyone has to, you know, take a look at what they think and why they think it. And if they're comfortable with it, be aware that what they're saying into the world can have these positive or negative effects, and become comfortable with it, but approach it more coherently than at least I'm seeing in my, you know, in the criminal justice policy sphere. I'm seeing another from Megan.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for your presentation. It just brings up a wealth of ideas and questions. And so where I'm landing, I'd just like to hear you talk a little bit more about knowledge translation and the types of research that are used. So I know there's evidence-based, and like there's qualitative, there's quantitative. I'm a qualitative researcher, and just thinking about all the different types of qualitative, and I'm just listening to, you know, how things change, and you need to be responsive. For example, we did a quick study last summer, like in a couple of months, and we were able to get our results out pretty quickly. But from a qualitative methodological point of view, oftentimes, and the type of research that I use, it's post-structural, it's critical, you know, socially constructed. And the belief there is that research can only capture a moment in time, which can be helpful, but it's not for all time. But, you know, even though you're looking at a particular issue, sometimes what comes out of it is like a way of being or a way of learning. And I know I'm kind of being a little bit abstract here, but, you know, there's lessons learned that could be applied in general as we go forth, and encourage people to be open to change in a particular way. And like, there's not the one truth, although, you know, that is kind of hard to get around because we often think that way. You know, what is it? We need to land on something so that we can make changes, and change takes time. And so all those complexities. So I guess just, you know, what are some of your thoughts about the type of research, and how do we work with our partners, and what's accepted, again, that qualitative, that quantitative, or even just nuances in there? I don't know. Anyways, I don't know if my question is clear, but there's just so much there, but I just love to hear where you land and what your response might be.
Sure, and I'll give just a bit of background. I'm actually, my background's in qualitative research, so my doctoral work was ethnographic in nature.
Okay.
I think we get into this in the paper, and it's a bit of more of a fringe movement in the evidence-based policy and criminal justice policy sphere. But that, you know, I think where I landed, it may not be adequately kind of critical post-structural, so there are people who would still say that doesn't go far enough on this, I accept that. But, you know, I feel like there's a big role for grounded theory here. I feel like the whole notion, you know, Glaser and Strauss say all is data, right? I think that's a perfectly valid claim in the evidence-based sphere. It's when I put up those slides earlier on, you know, the evolving definition of evidence-based. I think the old gold standard evidence-based concept that may be 100% continue, maybe it won't, I don't know enough about drug discovery, but let's say pharmaceutical research should and can continue to follow that trajectory, that's fine. But for social intervention, you simply can't account for enough stuff to say, we know what the all the active ingredients in this social intervention are, and we can tell you with 60% certainty that it will now work in Dartmouth, right? Like, I don't think that happens. So I think the idea that we're constantly generating and reiterating theoretical statements about the social world that we experience is the main goal of any evidence-based approach in social intervention. Now, sometimes that's amenable, especially when you get to kind of larger scale interventions that may be amenable to randomized control or natural experiment. But when we talk about doing an intervention for, like, you know, things like intensive foster care intervention, I mean, you're talking about sample sizes of like 10 in cities of several 100,000. The local context matters so much. The cultural context where those kids are being drawn from, plus their specific personal, you know, experiences. And then to say, oh, we have RCT evidence that this fostering intervention works. It's not credible on its own. It's useful as a starting point. We have RCT evidence. It worked in this context. Let's think about that context, I think, is an important thing to consider. But it doesn't, taking that the next step and saying it works or it doesn't work is, it doesn't get us anywhere in social policy development. I hope that answers your question, but I can elaborate more if useful.
Yeah, no, that absolutely does. I just find it very, very interesting. And so the social science and even the political piece of it, and that's sort of where I hear you talking. We had a discussion yesterday with some students and faculty in a small group that we have at the center, and we're always talking about, well, how do we get our research out there to make a difference? And so that KT piece, which, you know, not all of us are experts in, so looking to you and others to help us with that. And so when it is critical, when it is about racism, when it is about politics in a political way, yeah, how do you make that difference? But yeah, and if you, as you've said, you need to look at a variety of different methods. I guess the mixed method would be helpful too. So yeah.
And as far as I can tell, for what it's worth, and I'm not saying I'm not particularly well read. My background is in the sociology of organization. I'm not particularly well read in the translational science sphere, but as far as I can tell, there are almost no experts in this anyway. Most of what people are talking about, is the adoption of practice based on evidence. But a big gap, and I know there are people who have done work on this, especially in health science, climate science, education, but is how people actually hear the evidence they're given. And there's some work, there's good work on like how people hear anti-smoking messages if they're smoking or deciding to quit or whatever. There's less good evidence on how a conservative or a liberal leaning politician hears the evidence about safe injection sites, right? We don't know very much about that. And I don't think we're going to kind of science it out. I don't think we're going to be like, okay, we're just going to run a few experiments with some liberal politicians and some conservative politicians, and then we'll know what message we have to do if a liberal government is in power. But the idea about how people in elite status, decision making, and generally we give them the benefit of the doubt that they're intelligent, but they may have no scientific training in this area, yet have a portfolio where they have to make a decision. How do these people respond to scientific messages? I think is a big gap in our knowledge, as far as I can tell, everywhere.
Yeah, for sure. I see a number of students on the call, so I'll turn it over and see who else might like to say something, ask a question. Everyone's thinking. Yeah.
I'd be interested to know from anyone here, if anyone's able to share an experience. So, Megan, you just gave the example of, people trying to kind of make a difference with their work, using air quotes. I know that's not trying to be, but like what people mean when they say that. What people, because for me, I've talked enough about what do people expect their research to do? So when they do research, what's the idea behind, especially when we're talking about kind of translational-y stuff, what do people on the call who have done this or who want to work in this, what do they think research is for? That last slide about what's good for science and what is science for, like, what is the science for here? How do people see it?
Yeah. Not to call people out, but I know Brianna and Sydney, you've got some really interesting results and figuring out how to get that out. And I mean, Marilyn, you do grounded theory, so that was interesting that you mentioned that, Chris, as a methodological way that might be helpful in your area. But
yeah, I would say, this is Sydney speaking. To your point, I would say at the end, kind of when I came into research, my initial reactions or my initial thoughts for what I wanted to do with my research was enact change of some sort, whether it be behavior change or practice and policy change. And like you mentioned, using evidence to inform those changes. But I find it incredibly interesting. You're just saying, well, it depends. Not necessarily depends, but it influences, someone's perceptions. Are they conservative? Are they liberal? How are they receiving that message is incredibly interesting.
Right on. Yeah, and I think for what it's worth, I don't only think that the targets even for these intelligent lay audience have to sit at the kind of political elite level. A lot of it can be about how you communicate scientific findings both to and through kind of grassroots organizing. So what do these things mean? What do these scientific findings mean for these groups, and or did they even consider those groups, right? When we aggregate findings, so the meta, the preference for meta-analysis that's out there now in the kind of evidence-based field, well, that's gonna it kind of inherently silence some versions of difference. And I think that those are important considerations when we look at those pieces of evidence. I also think it's just worth noting that, to Megan's point, that this adoption of the JBI reviews versus the Campbell and Cochrane reviews, I think those are interesting tensions in the field. As a mostly qualitative researcher, I think I've done one study that would make the grade for inclusion in a true systematic review, because it has a data set that was tested in with a control group. The rest of it is interpreting social worlds.
So Chris, it's Marilyn. When you're talking about your work, certainly your comment in terms of the work that you've done and being included in a systematic review, Cochrane, up until quite recently, that would be correct. But it's interesting that they are entertaining looking at some qualitative work now. And of course, JBI has 10 different types of reviews that you can conduct. So you can conduct a review of qualitative studies as being one of them, quantitative, of course, and then there are a whole series of others, scoping reviews being one of the common one, text and opinion, that sort of thing. So that's certainly, I'm sure that's why JBI came into existence, was because, of course, Cochrane was the only game in town, and so the only studies that could be looked at initially were randomized control trials. So it's encouraging to see growth, or what I consider to be growth.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think those are really good. So I think those are really good developments. I wasn't aware that Cochrane was entertaining qualitative. I know I've seen some. Campbell is like the, I guess, the social science version of Cochrane, and I know some people have done kind of Campbell reviews that, you know, by attrition of not being enough RCT data, had to start including stuff that had some descriptive aspects. But so that's great. So that's there with Cochrane. I think, but it still brings us to, and this may also be relevant to Megan's point, was or an earlier point Megan made, was that there are going to be, you know, questions for which social scientific insight is very useful, but for which that, you know, that form of evidence is completely irrelevant. And that there will be, you know, small groups of people in localized contexts where, you know, we want to help. Like what I think, when I think about what the science is for, it's about sense making, and where we make our choices kind of on a moral ethical standpoint is for whom do we want to help the world make sense? Who do we want to provide information that allows people to act better, whether it's more in their own interest, whether it's more in the way they said they wanted to, or whether it's you know, helping to solve a problem. But how do we help people act in the world, and who do we direct our efforts towards to help them act and navigate you know, identified problems, challenges. And sometimes, you know, sometimes the goal with certain social problems is, you know, just it wouldn't be amenable to a lot of the scientific evidence, but you can still take a systematic approach to addressing the problem, to creating kind of, you know, I guess to understanding the inherent logic of the problem, the structure of the problem. And these are kind of drawn from, there's a guy in the kind of harm reduction literature called Malcolm Sparrow. And he writes about how one of the things we've gotten away from in crime policy, at least, in moving towards an evidence-based approach, is away from kind of the more naturalistic, or the natural sciences approach to observation and description. So we've really pushed away from observational and descriptive science from a funding perspective, from a training perspective, and towards more data analysis. But lots of social problems, there isn't a remotely coherent, descriptive, observational account of what that problem actually is before people start to try to address it with.
Yeah, one example, Chris, that Megan alluded earlier to grounded theory, and I do grounded theory, and was always impressed with the work of Judith Wiest in New Brunswick. And Judith, at the height of her research career at UNB, was doing research with intimate partner violence, and generated a theory about the process as people leave situations of violence. And so the province actually took up that research and used it for policy development in terms of supporting individuals leaving situations of intimate partner violence. So, you know, a very when things like that happen, it's very encouraging. And it also speaks to the uniqueness of everything, you know, the phenomenon itself, where that phenomenon is unfolding, the structures that exist in a province, in a country, etc., as to, you know, the relevancy of the research. And so this one certainly, it was nice to see the work and to see it taken up in a meaningful way. And then I believe the concepts from that work, then Judith and one of her research partners at UNB then went on to test those concepts as well. So yeah, your work just reminded me of some good stuff.
Right on. No, I mean, I think, and you said Judith's work was on intimate partner violence. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and I think intimate partner violence is a perfect example here in crime policy. So for people who don't know this policy area from a criminological standpoint, in the 80s, there was a series of RCTs done in Minnesota on intimate partner violence responses. So we'd moved from, like, you know, it being police just, you know, would respond and say, well, this is a family matter. We don't want to break up the family, so we're not going to intervene, to a pro-arrest policy. So they said, well, what happens if we remove the offender, right? And it was based on a theory that, you know, all offenders were persistent and that offenses would escalate. So everyone gets arrested. So it's called pro-arrest, pro-charge, pro-prosecution. And so they try this in Minnesota, and it gets better outcomes for the victim and the offender. So less reoffense down the line, less sort of immediate morbidity and mortality for the victim. So this finding then gets reproduced in another American city, and based on these kind of two studies, it's everywhere. And by the end of the 80s in Canada, at least mid-90s, pro-arrest, pro-charge, pro-prosecution is the predominant model of domestic and intimate partner violence response in Canada. And the problem that we found over time, so I was doing a project with some people, so I don't know if you know Nancy Ross at the School of Social Work. We were working,
I know who Nancy is, yeah.
So Nancy, so I was supporting Nancy on a project on pro-arrest, pro-charge, pro-prosecution in Nova Scotia. And I think first, to your point, that it takes a unique shape in Nova Scotia relative to other provinces that have enacted similar policies. What we're starting to see is from the data where people have retested these interventions, that mandating arrest for all offenses has led to negative impacts for the victim, which runs counter to the theory. And so you're seeing increased mortality, especially over time, particularly from the mechanism they're proposing is things like life disruption from having a partner removed, especially where that partner was. And so accepting that there were lower and higher risks of harm in intimate partner violence, that some instances of intimate partner violence would be acceptable for things like a restorative justice framework, are only now being talked about. Only in the last couple of years in North America are these being talked about as real possible policy options. Anyway, so it's interesting that you picked that because it's one of these ones where certain science pushed a policy option for 30 years that took over the whole continent, when in fact it was actually pretty limited science.
Mm. Thank you.
I see that Brianna has a note in the chat space. If you're still there, Brianna, if you wanted to jump in there and share your thoughts.
Hi, it's Brianna. Yes, I just wanted to apologize. I kind of had heard my name while I was in the kitchen, but I had missed a bit of the conversation beforehand. But yeah, I'm intrigued. I kind of need to rewatch this presentation, I think, to really engage with everything a little bit more. But it's just interesting, as I think you kind of touched on, like what the public perceives in terms of evidence and how they understand it. And I think I've thought about that a little bit with my own work, just with how the doctoral study intervention that I have, which was creating an informational website, and even study communication. So how are my recruitment materials being perceived or being understood? And I know it's not kind of totally aligned with what you've talked about today, but just kind of a point that I had considered with this. But thanks very much for your presentation. It's been really exciting to hear, and I am going to rewatch it again and kind of engage with it a little bit more directly, I guess. Thanks, Chris.
Right on. Yeah, and no, I mean, I think to that point, like a lot of, I mean, I've worked, so having worked in the UK before now, and then back in Canada, the kind of, if you think about research materials to participants and the kind of ethics regime in the two countries, there's a lot of stringency that makes ethics almost legalistic, and whether you've committed to giving your research results to study participants and things like that. But when we think about what the good of these acts is, and what the good of the informed consent statement is, when you have limited capacity to understand what research is. Like I worked for the police for 4.5 years, and there were people I worked with on an almost daily basis who couldn't articulate really what research is. Like, they wouldn't know how to differentiate research from all kinds of other activities. And then to ask an average person to think about how university research fits into the world they exist in, and what risks of participation, might genuinely be. I think those are fair questions that hinge on many of the same challenges I'm talking about today.
Great.
Thank
Well,
you.
I see our time is coming to the end. Want to make sure, but does anyone have a quick last comment or question? Great. Good. Well, we want to thank you so much, Chris, for your presentation and lively discussion afterwards, complex topic. So we know where you are and where we might be able to contact you if we have further connections that we'd like to make. So thank you so much.
All right. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Perfect. Thanks for coming, everybody.